Good evening and welcome. I'm going to introduce myself again tonight. Really pleased to have you here. So happy to have you join us for tonight for a really special lecture by Laura Hoptman about our 2019 Nasher Prize laureate, Isa Genzken. Before I introduce Laura, who graciously joins us tonight from the Drawing Center in New York, where she serves as executive director, I want to begin by thanking those who have made the Nasher Prize possible, especially our presenting sponsor, J.P. Morgan Chase & Company, and Howard and Finch and Hallam, who are also serving as prize co-chairs this year. We also want to thank co-chair John Dayton for his substantive support, as well as continue to thank the founding partners of the Nasher Prize, the Eugene McDermott Foundation, and Nancy A. Nasher and David J. Hemesegger. Our appreciation also goes to our media partners, Below Media Group, Paper City, and KERA's Art and Seek, and to our car sponsor, Classic BMW. We're exceedingly grateful to each of you for your generosity. All of your contributions make the enriching programmatic aspects of the prize possible, from the extensive education initiatives that make the work of each laureate accessible to people of all ages, to the series of international discussions about sculpture that we host around the world in partnership with other institutions, Nasher Prize Dialogues. These programs are all important ways that the Nasher can fulfill its mission to spread the word about the practice of sculpture, which was the great hope of our museum's founder, Raymond Nasher. Now, it is my privilege to introduce tonight's guest speaker. This past summer, when our Nasher Prize jury chose Isa Genzken to be the 2019 Nasher Prize laureate, our thoughts turned quickly to the question of who might speak about Genzken's work at this evening's gathering. The question presented a challenge, a good one, of an embarrassment of riches. Such is Isa Genzken's prominence that a number of the world's most respected curators and scholars have worked with her and have written about her work. That said, for us, one individual stood out. In awarding the Nasher Prize to Isa Genzken, you see, our jurors noted not only the quality of this artist's work, but also the outsized influence that work has had on younger generations of artists. And one curator, Laura Hoptman, has organized both a retrospective of Isa Genzken's work, as well as individual and group shows of younger artists whose work has benefited from Genzken's example. Hoptman has been a curator of contemporary art and a leading presence in the international art conversation for 3 decades. She came to the Drawing Center in September 2018 after 8 years as a curator in the Department of Painting and Sculpture at the Museum of Modern Art, an institution where she also began her career in the 1990s as a curator with a specialty in drawing. Among the dozens of exhibitions that Hoptman has curated include Drawing Now, 8 Propositions, a landmark exhibition of contemporary figurative drawing at MoMA, and retrospectives of the work of Elizabeth Peyton, Yayoi Kusama, Isa Genzken, Henry Taylor, Kai Althoff, and Bruce Conner. In 2004, she curated the 54th Carnegie International at the Carnegie Museum in Pittsburgh. And in 2007, she led the team of curators who organized Unmonumental, an exhibition of contemporary assemblage that reopened the new museum in New York. She's published widely on the work of Kusama and Genzken and on more general issues of contemporary painting, drawing, and sculptural assemblage. We're deeply honored that such an important voice can be part of this year's prize, and deeply grateful that she has accepted our invitation. Please join me in welcoming Laura Hoptman.
Thank you so much, Jeremy. Thank you to everyone here at the Nasher. I am so delighted to be here in Dallas, and especially to honor and to think about the great Isa Genzken, who today turns 70 years old. It is her birthday, which is a wonderful thing. Let me see where I can find. I come to you from the Drawing Center in New York on Wooster Street, where I've been the executive director for exactly 9 weeks. And I invite you to come and visit the Drawing Center the next time that you're in New York, and I know that many of you come often, because I am enormously grateful also to be able to talk to you about Isa Genzken's sculptural life, because I know that this is a room full of avid collectors and people who think deeply and look carefully at modern and contemporary art. You are the best kind of audience to talk to about this wonderful artist. Some of you might not know who Isa Genzken is, and it's understandable. And I actually would like to start with an absolutely extraordinary anecdote from a couple of weeks ago. I was at a gala affair and sat next to a young person, a woman maybe in her 30s, who was a literary person, a novelist, but was also an art critic. And she told me that she was just finishing her review of the Sarah Lucas retrospective that is now at the New Museum. And maybe some of you have seen that retrospective. Lucas is a sculptor from the YBA generation, born in 1962, so she's late mid-career, and this is the first big retrospective of her work. And I asked this young critic what she thought about Lucas, because I said, I really am interested to know, because I think that there's an argument here about whether this kind of in-your-face, sexually explicit assemblage is the kind of work that we need to see right now. And I'm fascinated to read what you're going to say in your article in Art Forum. And she said, well, the most important thing about Sarah Lucas is that she's the most important living women sculptor today. And I said, interesting. What about Isa Genzken? And she said, who? And I thought, well, of course, it's rather loud. It was one of those galas, so I thought she didn't hear what I said. So I said, Isa Genzken. And she said, sorry? And I said, Isa Genzken. And I took a napkin and I wrote out her name. She said, I'm sorry, I don't know who that is, and turned away. I am happy, then, to come here to talk to you about Isa Genzken, because all of you know who she is. But if you don't, it's understandable. Although this German artist has been working and exhibiting for more than 40 years, it is really only over the last decade or so that the world has recognized her importance to the history of post-war European art, as well as to international contemporary art today. In those 40 years, Genzken has worked in mediums ranging from film to photography, from painting to performance. She has made her mark on 3 generations of artists internationally. Her films are structuralist wonders, her drawings geometric and assured, and I show you one on the left, and her paintings are strange and singular. I show you one on the right from her basic research series. This is, you will recognize, Frottage. It is a portrait of her studio floor. That was made with a mixture of oil paint and canvas. She puts the canvas on the floor and then rubs so that the irregular cement floor is then, in a way, photographically reproduced in a strange rhyming with photography in a painting like this. But with all this exemplary work, it is her sculpture that has made her name. She has made small works. She has made monumental works. This rose was installed at Zuccotti Park about 3 weeks ago, a private collector giving it to the city of New York. It's the second rose that blooms in New York City. One of them is in the garden at the Museum of Modern Art. Genzken has been making these flowers since the the beginning of the 1990s, the first one being in Leipzig, and she continues to make this series. It's been going on now for almost 20 years. So she does monumental works like the rose, that's 18 feet high, to installations, to in situ architecture and public sculptures. An artist of her time in her younger years, she is now an indelible influence on the work of artists 3 generations her junior. Isa Genzken was born in Bad Oldesloe near Hamburg in 1948. This is her and her mom. She was the only child of 2 intellectual parents, a doctor and an actress, both of whom encouraged her creativity. Her beauty financed her interest in art, and she went to a series of art schools, first in Hamburg and then in Berlin. This is Genzken as a model when she was 19 or 20 years, between 19 and 21 years of age. She worked as a professional model. So after Hamburg and Berlin, she finally landed in 1972 at the Dusseldorf Academy. The Dusseldorf Academy, where the great Joseph Beuys presided over a faculty that included Gerhard Richter as the painting instructor. You can see this, if I could point out, do you see Isa? She's at the far left of the screen, my far left of the screen, behind Beuys's left shoulder. When she started at the Academy, she joined students including Katharina Fritsch and Thomas Struth. She's also contemporary of Martin Kippenberger and Rosemary Trockel, who were living and working in Cologne, a short train ride from Dusseldorf, but part of that same milieu. So if you want to locate her in terms of her contemporaries, it would be among Fritsch, Struth, Kippenberger, and Trockel. Genzken chose to study with Gerhard Richter, and it was a choice that would alter her life and influence her career. It can be argued that as their relationship developed, and it was a relationship that culminated in a decade-long marriage beginning in 1982, that they influenced one another, and I'll speak about that in a minute. But at her early point in her career, Genzken was most fascinated with the American minimalists and post-minimalists like Carl Andre, Lawrence Weiner, Saul LeWitt, and Dan Graham, who actually became a close friend, still is a close friend to this day because they bonded on their love of rock and roll music and club going. And to this day, they still sneak away and go to clubs. This was Genzken's milieu as a young student in Dusseldorf. These artists, a generation older than she was. Her first major series of sculptures were begun in 1976 at art school, and they were these magnificent painted wood forms, ones that touch the ground at only one spot, here on the left, called ellipsoids, and shapes that touch the ground at their extremities, called hyperbolids or hyperbolos in German, on my far left. These are enormously ambitious works for a student. They ranged from 10 feet long to 30 feet long. They're extraordinary objects, and they look nothing like anything created then or now. They're notable for another reason also. They're shapes which delineate curves that were mathematically calculated by a computer program, written by a physics student, and translated into 3 dimensions. It actually, to be specific, Genzken would make sketches, hand them to her friend who was a physics student and a computer programmer, and we're talking about 1976 now, and he would translate them into 3-dimensional models, which were then industrially produced in the carpenter shop at the university. These sculptures then make her among the first artists ever to be working with a computer at that time. This is a work called Rot, Gelb, Schwarz, Doppelellipsoid Zwilling, better known as the twins. This notion of machine precision became a kind of aesthetic precept for Genzken, one that she holds on to this day. During the same period in which she created the ellipsoids and the hyperbolos, she created an astonishingly prescient series of photos in which she re-photographed advertisements for high-end stereo equipment. So this work is a re-photograph of a magazine spread for Hitachi stereo. These elegant postmodern gestures are, of course, a prelude to the work of the Los Angeles photographer Christopher Williams, who a short time thereafter began his exploration of similar objects. And of course, Williams' students, the virtual school of LA photographers that come in Williams' wake, and Collier and Elad Lazary. They also were interested in the rephotography of advertisements, and especially technical advertisements. But Genzken chose to make her series in 1979. Imagine, 1979 is when she did this rephotography, as a parallel aesthetic act to the sculptures that she was creating at the time. And do forgive me for the darkness of the slide, but you can see the 1 hyperbolo and 4 ellipsoids, and in the back there's a series of 4 photographs of this high-end stereo equipment. Genzken admired the sleek, minimal aesthetic of the advertising, like Chris Williams. But she also admired the aesthetics of the objects that were being advertised, so doubly so. Genzken stated that she chose stereo equipment as the subject of these photographs because she saw it as, quote, the most modern object that she could find, and as such, a challenge to her sculpture. Sculpture, she has famously stated, should at least be as modern as stereo equipment. To test this, Genzken liked to exhibit her sculptures with this series of photos, as well as with another photographic series, that of women's ears. Now, this series was done in the streets of New York in 1980. She would pass by a person, a lady, and if she liked their ears, she would ask them whether she could photograph them. The ear photographs, which come in many different sizes, in black and white and also in color, are perhaps the more clearly connected thematically to the ellipsoids and the hyperbolos than the stereo equipment is, because Genzken saw the human ear as a natural receiver and thus perfectly paired with sculptures that are actually the shape of waveforms. An ellipsoid is a downturning wave meeting an upturning wave, and a hyperbolo is two upturning waves back to back, 2 smiles back to back. The ellipsoids and the hyperbolos caught the eye of Conrad Fisher, the artist and gallerist whose eponymous gallery was perhaps the most influential gallery in Cologne in the 80s, in the midst of a passel of important galleries, including Gallery Schmela and Gallery Rudolf Werner. In the 1980s, and I don't have to tell this crowd this, Cologne was the place to see cutting-edge art of a number of generations. It was the place to see, in Europe, Carl Andre, Robert Morris, Lawrence Wiener, Dan Graham, Joseph Beuys, Gerhard Richter, Sigmar Polke, Blinky Palermo, all of them exhibited and showed up regularly in Cologne, and Genzken saw all those shows and hung out with exactly those artists. There's no doubt that Genzken's ellipsoids and hyperbolos join a history of modern sculpture, from constructivism, and I show you to the left a Katarzyna Kobro, to minimalism, and then here a Saul Lewitt, again, an artist who Genzken has admired very much and knew. But there is something that makes these works different, and this difference was not lost on the critics, who pretty much hated on these works when they were exhibited. Pretty much she got negative reviews across the board. You see, they have geometric precision, and they're made industrially, but they're also recognizable as something. Spears, canoes, toothpicks, or as one sexist critic disdainfully described them, knitting needles. Yikes! It's narrative! Much as she admired the minimalist generation, Genzken did not deny the possibility of narrative. She embraced it, reiterating that, quote, the associative aspects of these works were there from the very beginning. This, at this time, 1976 through 1982, in Cologne, was revolutionary as turning to the computer to make your work. That she was absolutely sure that narrative content should be embedded in what was read at the time as minimal form is made evident in her second major series of sculptures, monumental works made from cement blocks. Genzken expert and art historian Sabine Breitewieser has called this series of work a European answer to minimalism. And I know that many of you have seen these sculptures, but I want to give you a sense of its scale because I haven't put its dimensions. These bases, these metal bases, iron bases, are come to me about here to me. I'm 5'2", so they're about 5 feet tall. Above which are these cement constructions that are at least 5 feet tall. So we're talking about 11 or 12 feet of massive, massive sculpture, and it's important to know that. And these works certainly seem to partake or take on the language and materials of minimalism. And here I juxtapose it with a floor piece by Carl Andre, though keen eyes can see the reference to Joseph Beuys in the high metal bases that were devised by Genzken. Don't they look like the Beuys bases where his dioramas sit? They're taller, but they're very like Beuys. These works, created in two separate series, the first in 1987 and the second in 1988 and 89, are based in architecture. And even if you don't notice that these sculptures are made of building materials, they have a connection to buildings that Genzken helpfully underscores by naming them after churches, banks, houses, and the like. This is not metaphoric or alliterative. This is straight up architecture, connected to architecture and to building. But it's not just any building that Genzken is referring to in this series. Anyone who has seen photos of bombed-out cities in Germany can recognize that these sculptures resemble the ruins of German cities after Allied bombing, and specifically Genzken's home city of Berlin. And it would be the memory of that, because as I told you, she was born in 48, so it was only as a very small child that she would have known those big famous piles of rubble, and if the resolution on the projector would be right, you would see that. But Berlin specifically, because of the building materials that were used to make the buildings, had these buildings that were of gray stone with a cement core. So they resonate specifically as ruins, specifically as post-war German ruins. Now, again, to this audience, I don't have to say, if there are a few hard rules for post-war German artists, the foremost one has to be, don't talk about the war, make no reference to World War II. Especially for Genzken's generation, born too late for the war itself, but not for its devastation, raised by culpable and or suspect parents, grandparents, and teachers, and led in government by politicians with obscured pasts. There are very few artists who went there. Literary figures like Günter Grass, Walter Abisch, Heinrich Böll, in cinema, Fassbinder, I'm thinking of The Marriage of Maria Braun, but very few artists. One of them, though, is Gerhard Richter. Here's his painting from 1965, his masterpiece, small masterpiece, Uncle Rudy, taken from a family photograph. The 1980s was the period of Genzken's career when she worked most closely and in parallel with Gerhard Richter. And it seems that the older artist might have inspired the younger one, or at least shown her a path to grapple with the taboo subject of recent German history. And I will add here, I don't have a slide, but during the same time, circa 1988, Genzken did a major installation of a group of collages called Der Spiegel, after the German magazine, still the most important German magazine, a kind of mixture of Life magazine and Time magazine, a news weekly with a lot of pictures. When Genzken did a room full of these Time magazine or Der Spiegel magazine covers, it was the same moment that her husband, Gerhard Richter, was working on his great series, October 18th, 1977, aka the paintings of the death, of the suicides of the Stern Gang, the Baader-Meinhof group, which was also from 1988. Who was influencing who at that moment is hard to tell, but both of them were using the photograph as an object, Richter as well as Genzken. I want to bring that in because it's very clear that the younger artist was looking to the older artist, who after all was her teacher, but there was also some sort of symbiosis back and forth between the older artist to the younger, looking at the younger artist's work as well. Those concrete sculptures were the first works that Genzken exhibited in the United States at the Marion Goodman Gallery in New York in 1989, and maybe one or two of you remember that show. That Goodman was Richter's gallery did not help their reception, which was quite cool, especially from collectors and from museums. There are lots of reasons why this could have happened, why Genzken's work was disdained and ignored. It could have been their content, though the same museums and collectors were venerating Wagnerian lugubriousness down the hall with Anselm Kiefer. Maybe it was their emotional rectitude, their kind of minimal look. Maybe it was their size. It's more suited to public display than private. These are big, big, heavy objects. Or maybe it was that their author was married to Gerhard Richter, rapidly becoming the most venerated living European artist. This is my aside, non-art historical aside. But no matter how worthy a female artist might be, any indication that her career has received help from a better-known male partner can be a danger, if not a poison, to her artistic future. As it was, we suspect, or I suspect, with Isa Genzken. I only have evidence from personal experience, so I'm going to use the case in point of my former employer, the wonderful Museum of Modern Art. The house of Gerhard Richter, it's his cultural home, as a result of his career retrospective in 2005, and as a result of its definitive collection of this artist's work. In fact, October 18th, 1977, that group of pictures is in the collection of the Museum of Modern Art. It is not this German national treasure, actually is in the United States in the collection of MoMA. MoMA did not have an Isa Genzken work in their collection until 2013, the year of Genzken's own retrospective there. Why? It's possible that Genzken might have been ignored as an artist in a mixture of suspicion that Genzken's work was exhibited because of her connection to Gerhard Richter, or, I suspect, as a kind of deference to Richter and his feelings, because by 1994 they had already been divorced, somewhat acrimoniously. I'm happy to report now that they remain friends. They've become friends. Thankfully, there was one Richter enthusiast, Suzanne Gez, longtime director of the Renaissance Society in Chicago, who was also impressed by Genzken's work. She was impressed by Gerhard Richter's work as well as Isa Genzken's. Recognizing that architectural modernism was at its core, she invited Genzken to Chicago for a residency in order to make work for an exhibition. Gez was right about Genzken's passions. Chicago's distinctive architecture, especially its skyscrapers, inspired Genzken to create an entirely new body of work in both cement and in a new material, epoxy. Using primarily the three-part Chicago window as her inspiration, as well as the facade of the newly erected Hancock Building, which you see on the right here, on the left here, a magnificent monumental sculpture just called X. And by the way, this is the moment that Genzken started painting. She has several paintings also using this tilted X motif that she gets from the Hancock Building. So, using the notion of using the visual prompt of the three-part Chicago window as an inspiration, as well as the Hancock Building, she created an astonishing group of windows, some freestanding and other on her boys-inspired stands, like I showed you previously. These are extraordinary works. This work, among others, these were more clearly architectural in nature than any works that had come before them. but they also retained poetic content. This one is called Fenster or Window, and you can see the Chicago window style. And this is something that's pushing 15 feet high. You have two levels of epoxy, and then on the crowned with cement that has been molded cement, taken out of a mold. It's an extraordinary work. I think you will agree with me that one hasn't seen anything like this, and then or since. This is 1992. So she called this exhibition very poetically, and here's another famous one, Bismarckstrasse, which resides in a collection in Salzburg, Salzburg, Austria, not Vienna. It used to be Vienna, now in Salzburg. She called her show in Chicago, Everybody Needs at Least One Window. The show traveled to Brussels and to Munich, but it remained the first and last solo exhibition in a museum in the United States that Genzken was to enjoy until the MoMA retrospective 21 years later in 2013. The mid-1990s represents a watershed in Genzken's life. Divorced from Richter, she left Cologne and moved to Berlin, then at the very beginning of its blossoming into Germany's cultural capital. Berlin was the city where Genzken had spent her adolescence, and her mother still resided in the area. Her mother passed away a year ago. I think she was 103 years old. Her return to Berlin was a kind of homecoming, but it was also kind of a revolutionary act. Doing this, she left her elders and her peers in Cologne and aligned herself artistically with a younger generation, including artists like Wolfgang Tillmann, who took this photo of Genzken on a visit to New York that they took together the same year that she left Cologne in 1996. And she's in front of the closed Sound Factory, a club. Genzken has been a frequent visitor to New York since she was a young teenager, and in the summer of 1996, free of a tough marriage and the high-profile art world of Cologne, she arrived in New York and rented a studio in Hoboken. Over 2 manic months, Genzken created her first work of assemblage, a 3-part series of bound collage books called I Love New York, Crazy City, that chronicles her movements from the Waldorf Astoria, where she checked in, to a YMCA on the Lower East Side, where she checked out. And she does this through bills, taxi receipts, invitations to openings, magazines, and newspaper clippings, and Polaroid photos. They're all held together. You can't see it, unfortunately, because of we've lost color in the slides, but they're all held together with red caution tape, arranged in a kind of a grid. So the pages of these oversized volumes, and you can get a reproduction of I Love New York, Crazy City from Taschen, I think. It's about this big. Fantastic book. The spreads resemble storyboards, but more fancifully, that is filmic storyboards. And there's a whole other part of Isa Genzken that I'm not getting into that can delve into her connection to film. She makes films and videos, and a lot of her sculptural language can be connected to film. But a more fanciful way of looking at them, my more fanciful way, is that they also resemble, these spreads, the facades of office buildings through which New York's busy interior life can be seen. From this moment on, that's 1996, assemblage enters into Genzken's sculptural vocabulary. This is a work called The Slot Machine from 1999-2000, and it is a self-portrait of Isa Genzken. You can see her photo atop it. That's another Wolfgang Tillmann photo, and the covering of this slot machine is full of those people that she knows. Here to the far right, like at the shoulder of the slot machine, is Kai Althoff. There are other artists who she befriended, younger artists who she befriended at the time, as well as people in her dreams that she wished to befriend. So there's a picture, for example, of Michael Jackson there too. But altogether, it's a kind of self-portrait of Genzken. So from this moment, this assemblage enters into her sculptural vocabulary, and it is also from this moment that Genzken's identity as an artist, known to but outside of the clique of German titans of contemporary art, is cemented. In other words, this is the moment that she swerves from that path. She was literally in the center of the art world, married to the most arguably the most respected living artist other than Jasper Johns, living painter at the time. She knew everybody. She lived in the center of the earth. What did she do? She moved to Berlin, where things were just starting, and started hanging out with 22-year-olds. Joining a small gallery in the former East German neighborhood of Mitte, Genzken, and that's Neuger Riemschneider, for those of you who remember the 1990s or who patronize them now. They're a gallery of two guys, both of them from Cologne, who moved to Berlin with a stable of artists mixing Germans and Americans, including Franz Ackermann, Elizabeth Payton, Rickert Tirvanit, Tobias Rehberger. This is all my generation, so I'm doing this from memory. These are all artists about my age, but that group, and Andy Genzken, of all people. So she forged relationships with this younger generation of artists like Tillman, because he's that age too, around 50-something, early 50s. And she threw herself into the Berlin techno and club scene. And as I said earlier, at 70, she's still going to dance clubs. This is a work called The Schwules Babies. These are a lesser-known series of Genzken's assemblages from 1997. As you can see, they are made from twisted kitchen implements. She went to a restaurant supply store and got them. So it has this sort of constructivist look. Some of them hang from the wall like this one does. Others of them hang freestanding. But they're also, just as all of Genzken's work, there is this narrative content. This Schwules baby is, imagine it like a puppet. It's a kind of personage, and the personage is a dancer, and a techno dancer, who's, just so that interpretation is driven home, she is sprayed, every one of these, with a kind of fluorescent spray paint, the kind that you use in techno clubs and also with graffiti. But you can see every one of these Schwules babies has a torso and a head. Some of them have a central piece as well, and some of them have like a cake pan that are hips, but all of them have that sort of swaying motion that remind you of a kind of puppet-like dancer, a techno dancer specifically. In 1999, Genzken was invited back to New York by the artist collective AC Project Room, a single-room gallery located on the far west end of Broome Street. AC Project Room was a not-for-profit gallery, not-for-profit because they couldn't sell anything, gallery that was started by two artists, Paul Bloodgood and Ann Chu, both of whom, unfortunately, we lost over the past 2 years, in both of them at age 58, as well as a third partner, a musician and art dealer from Berlin who had relocated to New York, a fellow named Christoph Geratzis. And if you want to know the history of AC Project Room, which is an amazing one, it was the first place that showed Matthew Barney, for example, you can find Christoph behind a desk at Anton Kern Gallery, where he's the director now. So, and actually, Christoph, because he spoke German, was Isa's handler, Isa Genzken's handler, so he has amazing stories about Isa Genzken. And personally, I remember in a taxi cab going down the West Side Highway and looking to my left and seeing some figure, like dressed in motley, brightly colored stuff, going through garbage cans. And I was maybe 10 blocks away when I realized, it's Isa Genzken. And what she was doing, oh my gosh, was foraging for the materials for this exhibition. So the show was called F the Bauhaus, New Buildings for New York, and she made 6 sculptures, which represent the beginning of a vocabulary that she's working with today. She was using scrap wood and objects found in the streets and the trash cans, and she created her version of New York modernism, sort of scrappy and jury-rigged, but perfectly attuned to the New York street life. It seems like the buildings are mixed. So you think of them as architectural maquettes on platforms. The platforms are actually crates, art crates that she found in Chelsea, and she pulled the outer layers off. So this is the interior of found crates. But she created these things that she presents as if they are architectural maquettes. What they're made of tells the story in a kind of contemporary updating of what the French call architecture parlante, or speaking architecture. The perfect example would be a library shaped like a book. That's architecture parlante. This work, for example, is made out of a pizza box, so it is a maquette for a restaurant. This one's a theater. You can see the playbill there. These are brilliant. These are absolutely brilliant. Almost immediately upon her return from the AC Project Room show, which, by the way, sold nothing, but blew the minds of the few people who saw it. I was one. The other one was Rachel Harrison, who saw the work and was astonished by its in-your-faceness and its power. Genzken returned to Berlin and created a sister series, also of architectural models, this one entitled New Buildings for Berlin. And this group featured architectural forms, but skyscrapers this time, whose sharp angles made clear reference to Mies van der Rohe's 1925 glass skyscraper project. It was never built, but it was always held up as the echt modernist monument that could have saved the cultural soul of Germany had they managed to do it before the onslaught of Nazism in 1932. However elegant these works look at first glance, I bet a lot of you have seen these sculptures because they do reside in American collections because they have been collected over the past 10 years, I would say, not when they first came out, but more recently. These sculptures are made from super cheap colored glass, the kind of inserts that are found in the front door lunettes of working class houses or even trailers. What's more, the glass panels are barely attached to one another. They lean at dangerous angles and threaten to fall apart at first joggle. Genzken has infused these elegant and minimal works with a stern critique of what she saw as the quick, cheap, and shoddy manner of building that was rapidly transforming her adored Berlin into a cookie-cutter metropolis no different from Shanghai or Delhi. And I am showing you a shot of the Potsdamer Platz in 2007, and those of you who visit Berlin know that Checkpoint Charlie, Potsdamer Platz, and other of these historically significant squares have, over the years since the fall of the wall, been repopulated by these enormous, fanciful corporate skyscrapers, not government, but corporate skyscrapers that do in fact look like Pudong in Shanghai or Delhi. For Genzken, these kinds of architectures exemplify 21st century Berlin's version more like perversion, that's what I wanted to say, of the pristine dream of Mies van der Rohe, and her beautiful but jury-rigged sculptures were a commentary exactly on that. So Genzken's obsessive love of New York and Berlin is ongoing, as is her fascination with certain themes, like urban life, but also with the destruction of cities, from the ruins of post-war Berlin to the pictures of Ground Zero after September 11th. Genzken was in New York on September 11th, 2001, and like everyone else who was in the city that day, it had a profound impact on her. And you can imagine, because here is an artist whose obsession is with skyscrapers and with ruins, and that day, both of those converged in the most horrible way. In 2003, she began what would be 2 series of assembled sculptures inspired by 9/11. Called Empire Vampire Who Kills Death, these works are assemblages made out of found objects, including toys, pieces of lighting fixtures, plastic construction netting, children's clothing, and even money. They are diorama-like, each like a scene from a war movie, and they're mounted on wooden plinths just high enough so that you can see them at eye level. They are enormously dangerous for anybody who has children 10 years of age or younger, because the corner of these metal plates are right at eye level for kids. Just saying. So we see them. They're not as tall as the boys-like plinths, but close. So again, for a person my height, you can see it just at eye level, and you're meant to travel through these dioramas with our eyes in a very cinematic fashion. And in fact, she created a video that she very often shows with this installation of these works, that it does exactly that. She has a mini cam, probably not an iPhone, this is pre-iPhone, and so it wanders through all these different dioramas, and she projects it on the wall, and it looks like a documentary, a war documentary, but it has no sound. So like her cement works from the late 1980s, these sculptures take on a subject that most artists would never touch. But Genzken is not afraid of being tough in her work, and these are some of the toughest works in her entire career. So tough, in fact, that her high school friend, boyfriend in art school, and esteemed chronicler, the Harvard art historian Benjamin Buchloh, opined in print that Genzken's assemblages, beginning with Empire Vampire, are the results of mental trauma and psychosis. So shocked was Benjamin Buchloh that he literally wrote that Genzken's assemblages are the results of her mental illness. This criticism, coming from the extremely progressive pen of Buchloh, is shocking, in that it remands to the age-old diagnosis of hysteria leveled at any woman's transgressive act against established power, from marching for the vote to raising her voice in the workplace. It's certainly not the case with the carefully assembled and thought-through tableaus of Empire Vampire or any of the succeeding works, like this very complicated installation called Kinderfilmen, children filming. In fact, works like these ushered in a new period in Genzken's sculptural oeuvre, one that concentrates exclusively on tableaus made from found objects. From the Empire Vampire, this is quite like Empire Vampire, but what she's done is she's removed the bases and enlarged the tableau to be room size, which allows us to walk through and experience them on a one-to-one scale. If we're talking about film, the Filmic and the Theatrical, here we have the stage that we can interact with. In 2007, Genzken represented Germany at the Venice Biennale, arguably the highest honor any woman artist had received from the German state heretofore. Choosing transgression, are we surprised? Genzken covered the exterior of the Nazi-era pavilion in orange construction netting. On the interior, she created a one-to-one scale tableau or stage set that featured assembled objects, and the objects that you see in the front are rolly bags, and on the roller bags are collaged photographs and magazine, things cut from the magazine of very vulnerable animals like pussycats, sad-looking dogs, birds, things that were sort of vulnerable and kickable, and she put them, she papered her, the roller bags with those. Interspersed are aliens, and coming from the ceiling are two mannequins kitted up like American astronauts, and they're coming down to save the vulnerable animals from the aliens. The whole thing was called Oil. In Genzken's continuing sculptural evolution over the past decade, she's begun to incorporate mannequins more and more. It started with oil, and has created these wildly imaginative characters and puts them in very provocative situations. This was a work that she made for the 2013 MoMA retrospective. She called this group of mannequins, this being one, Schauspieler, or actors. And over the year, they've taken on the burden of narrative that the objects that were in her tableaus had previously. All of these mannequins have a little Genzken in them. In fact, in many cases, they wear her clothes. Here's another one wearing her hat and her jeans. But her most recent work take on the characters quite separate from the artist. This is a shot of an exhibition at Davis Werner Gallery last fall, so a year ago. And as you can see, they feature these pantsless mannequins that are swathed with some with cloth. These mannequins are rain ponchos that she's made burqas out of. So these are pantsless people wearing burqas. They're outrageous. But should we expect anything less? This show shocked many people, but it excited many others. At age 70, Isa Genzken can still do this. Never content to rest on her laurels, she's been relentless in the exploration of her loves and her obsessions, and rigorous in the exercise of her genius for three-dimensional composition. This is one of my very favorite sculptures by Isa Genzken. It's called My Brain, and it's made of a lump of plaster with all kinds of things embedded in it: a broken light bulb, photograph, pieces of broken toys, what she's been thinking about. And it's surmounted by a single antenna. For me, It's a self-portrait that says it all. Genzken is a brilliant and fearless innovator, but she's also a keen judge of her time and her place. She has fantastic radar, choosing as muses two cities that embody the fin de siècle of the 20th century and of the modern, New York and Berlin. She has bravely pursued a career that took her away from both an older generation and her own generation, and she started over with a view directly to the future, never to the past. And this strategy has borne fruit. If there was no Isa Genzken, there might not have been a Katie Noland, Sarah Lucas, and I got to tell that young lady who's doing that review, Rachel Harrison, Helen Martin, and the one fella, Simon Denny, and many, many other artists of this following two generations. But none of them, none, can match the breadth of Genzken's sculptural achievements, nor perhaps, more importantly, her sheer audacity. So I began with the question, who is Isa Genzken? I can answer it. I answer it with, she is our greatest living female sculptor and an exemplary recipient of the honor of this year's Nasher Prize. Thank you.